Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
Cameron, I think Jordan Peterson is backing himself into a corner, and we've been watching this happen for some time now. And I think this is a positive direction. Usually when you talk about somebody being backed into a corner, it's a negative. But let me outline to you what I think is going on and why it matters in our time. And I think you're going to have some other examples of thinkers and individuals who will fit in this category. Just to give everybody just a little refresher, rundown, reminder. Actually, I was talking to a friend, he's listening, you know who you are, at a soccer game the other evening about Jordan Peterson. And I said, largely when I look at Peterson, there are kind of three categories here. One is, kind of his original free speech stuff in Canada, which to me, that's makes sense. There's no argument there. I'm on board with, free speech and biology. Okay, thumbs up. Second category, he's interesting to me sociologically. I think if you look at his book, 12 Rules for Life, most people who grew up in a strong community, and particularly with a father, would be like, what is this book about and why is it so popular? Because it seems like pretty straightforward, basic young adult formation and just interpersonal knowledge. And then the fact that it's so massively influential shows us just kind of sociologically where we're at as we're thinking about personal responsibility and the way we hold and carry ourselves and we speak to other people. That stuff is obviously not obvious because he wrote a book that was a massive bestseller about it. So those two categories, I'm tracking along with him. Category 3 is theological. And it's been interesting to see his shift over the last, I think you can see it happening incrementally over the last several years. But I was reflecting on this again. So not claiming to be a Christian. I believe his wife is converted. He's certainly good friends now with a whole host of pretty deeply respected and knowledgeable Christians. And it's almost becoming a joke of, can you answer this question faster than Jordan Peterson can answer whether or not he believes in the resurrection? Because there's almost like a politicking kind of, he never directly will put his cards on the table on exactly what he believes, while giving this really long, convoluted, roundabout answer of saying this is why it could be true, even if it didn't happen, and definitely in the metaphorical and mythical hierarchy response. Okay, everybody, most people listening to this have been tracking with that for a while. I was listening to Alex O'Connor was hosting a conversation between Peterson and Dawkins. Haven't listened to the whole thing, but they had a back and forth on the virgin birth. And this is getting painful to watch. So basically, you'll have Dawkins say something like, "Okay, did it happen or not?" Like it's a yes or no question. This is a mistranslation from Isaiah. That's where the story came from. Did Jesus have a biological dad? And Peterson is very much on the defensive through the whole conversation, where he's not specifically answering that. He won't say yes or no to it, but he'll go into the depth of, like, there haven't been cultures that have flourished that haven't believed that, or that there's something that happened there that brought Rome to its knees and produced a flourishing, and that these truths are so deep in the reality of what it is that they mean that the scientific question of whether or not it happened almost doesn't matter. You can see their differences come up because Peterson will say something about, like, what about the truths written in Dostoevsky? It's fiction, but it's describing real human relationships in reality. And Dawkins is going to be like, who cares? Like, I'm talking about science, the stuff that gets us to the moon, not whether or not somebody could write fake stories that tell us about the nature of humanity. And so they're two very different. Peterson is wanting to use Christianity as a true myth, not as a historical fact, but as a overarching lens and worldview through which to see what he would see as his version of the flourishing of humanity. And so it's watching him be a Christian apologist while not believing specifically or able to articulate out loud the core tenets of Christian belief. And so I'm watching him do this, and it's painful because he's trying to defend things that don't fit into a Dawkins type scientific explanation, while at the same time knowing that there are things that are true that go beyond the scientific realm. but unwilling to cross that threshold of just saying of belief in a sense that actually makes it real. And so this is a whole host of academic intellectual thinkers who seem to be, when I say backing themselves into a corner, of being are continuously being pushed to run what they believe to its logical conclusion. And the logical conclusion doesn't quite make sense unless it actually really happened. And so we're seeing all these cultural Christians being kind of, I think, nitpicked down to the point of saying, okay, at some point you need to make a decision here, because this as a functional myth that isn't embedded in reality, that is real but didn't happen, just doesn't make sense to the same degree anymore. So it's almost like having a beautiful poem that doesn't map onto reality. Like it has an internal coherence to it to a certain degree, but it just doesn't come across as actually working. And so that's, yeah, we talk about Peterson, I don't know, what, twice a year or something, but this is just kind of a little update there on where I see him tracking in the progression of his intellectual and spiritual journey. Two questions. Do you think I have the right read there? And who are some other characters that fall into that same category?
Okay. You know, your beautiful poem example makes me think of Xanadu as a mythical, beautiful place conjured up in that little fragment by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. You know, those famous first lines: in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. And the reason, and that's not an incidental quote, the question there is, so that's a lovely poem about a fantastical realm. So,
well, the Jabberwocky,
when we talk about somebody like a sure. Well, the Jabberwocky is more nonsensical and funny. Xanadu actually is really beautiful sounding and enticing. And I think so. If a Dostoevsky, a Tolkien, are these people giving us some version of just a Xanadu, some beautiful idealism? I don't think that's what's under discussion here, I'll come back to that. I just wanted to introduce that as an interesting, as an interesting aside, because the true myth.
Here's why it's different. Here's why it's different, though, is because I've never seen an orc, where Peterson has seen a Christian. So Tolkien can write about Middle Earth as a vision of a thing that hasn't ever existed or been built or tried. But when you're talking about Christianity, you're talking about a thing that people have lived and died for millennia now. So there's a like if I could look out my window and see an elf chasing an orc, that would be different on the way in which the myth maps onto the world in which I see myself living.
But nobody expects, that's a separate conversation. Fiction gives you truth. Sometimes you can glean timeless truths from Lord of the Rings about courage and friendship and joy and perseverance, while knowing that Middle Earth is not a literal place, of course. But at a certain point, the whole true myth thing really will bring you to the place where you have to answer, all right, well, you've done a great exposition of the myth part, but is it actually true? And that's the revealing moment for somebody. And that's why it can be quite frustrating sometimes to watch Jordan Peterson. But so some of the other people who are coming along here, and I want to highlight some of the observations that go along with this and what's happening, and maybe introduce, I think, an important distinction that I think will be helpful. I hope will be helpful to us. But some of the other people in this category would be Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Now, Ayaan Hirsi Ali has herself become a Christian, but this is a group of intellectuals who are recognizing the benefits of a Christian heritage. It kind of starts there for many of them. Another example is David Brooks, writer for the New York Times. Now, he was on the fence for a while as well, but with him, a number of us started noticing, gosh, he's quoting Augustine of Hippo a whole lot. What's happening behind the scenes? And then because of some of our mutual friends, Nathan, I was privy to some facts about him before this went public, but basically talks about Os Guinness and others having very strategic conversations with him. But it was pretty remarkable to see him in a Trinity Forum discussion with James Davison Hunter not long ago, openly professing his Christianity. This is just it's just wild to see that. Not something I would have anticipated. And so very exciting and wonderful. And he's the other thing that characterizes somebody like a David Brooks, and you wouldn't think this given that he writes for the New York Times, he's immersed in news and in very progressive circles. He is absolutely filled with hope for our nation, for what's going with developments in the world. I mean, it's really neat to hear him say that. Hunter himself is not, and the two of them they're interesting conversation partners. But another example, and this one is a little bit closer to Jordan Peterson, would be Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, but the novelist and historian, most well known for Dominion, wonderful book. But he's become a very serious defender of Christianity, a kind of apologist in his own right. And from what I gather, he's still not on record as being a believer yet. Now, here's the distinction I want to try out on you, Nathan. You tell me what you think of this. Most of these people we have mentioned, Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and I think to an extent David Brooks, their interest in Christianity begins with a recognition of its civilizational benefits. And it's, you could even say, societal benefits. Now, this is an observation we have had for a long time from social scientists, particularly from sociologists and also psychologists, so both of those fields are very secular, but increasingly, many of some of the very respected people working in those areas recognize the social utility of religion. And they recognize, gosh, this is an absolute storehouse of meaning. It helps people live their lives with a sense of significance, and it binds people together. There is amazing social cohesion. Now, I'm using very cold, clinical, detached words and terminology to describe this, but of course, this is the language of the field. But increasingly, the question arises now, okay, if Christianity is so civilizationally beneficial, if it's so conducive to various forms of human flourishing and artistic flourishing and scientific flourishing, if that's the case, does that count as evidence for Christianity? Now, here's the distinction I want to introduce, because I think people who get worried about this and think, whoa, let me, I'm going to throw a flag
just
down
because
right
it works doesn't mean it's
in
true.
In the past, correct, yes. So, yeah, if we want to avoid those purely functional arguments, but also in the past, when Christianity had more of a stronger influence in the West, and let's just pick on North America now in particular, when you had, more traces of Christendom, where Christianity was seen as good, it was possible to call yourself a Christian for social advantages. You belong to a church so that you can run for public office in some, or you can qualify for a bank loan. It's in your best interest to be a part of a local congregation. It's definitely not in your best interest to be an avowed atheist, and telling people about that. That will actually, there's a social cost that comes with that. So I think that was a legitimate concern when you were in that day. But what's being discussed here is not keeping up with the Joneses cultural Christianity, or whatever, however you want to term it. I think cultural Christianity is the easiest way to designate it. What's happening now is you're seeing cultural breakdown on a massive scale, the failure of institutions and huge leadership failure. I mean, all the ways, but also just breakdown in social life and all of that, all those things that we're observing in the news and in our everyday lives and communities. And there's a recognition of the civilizational advantages that came with a Christian heritage. So that is different from just a shallow embrace of cultural Christianity for social advantage. That's the distinction I want to bring in. This is a recognition on a deeper level that interject.
Yeah, well, let me add a corollary to it. This is just a side thing to go with that. That developing at the same time in which pure science is losing its explanatory power for the breadth of experiences that humans have. So to some degree, those are both the same. But I just want to throw that in there. It's not just the political, cultural shifts and upheavals, and then
We'll say more about
stability that come. Well, I think the so I mean, people would frame, religion as an archaic thing. It's technologically dated. It doesn't speak to our time. But like an example my grandpa would use is say, say you're riding on a donkey beside somebody else riding on a donkey 2,000 years ago. Christianity is giving you the precepts and understandings of how it is that you treat that other person, and how you relate to God. And those conditions and that understanding is the same whether or not you're riding a donkey in Jerusalem or a rocket to Mars. The technology is independent of the structure of the propriety of the relationships with God and with each other. So it's not a category that evolves. But I think we thought we can parse these out scientifically speaking, and we just haven't. Like, we've run to the end of the rope of saying, and so this is where Peterson's going to push back on Dawkins, and is like, how in the world are you going to justify saying that the mistreatment of women is wrong? Like, science can't say that. That's not a scientific. And he's like, so the idea that God created the male and female and they're in his image and they have equal value in that sense is kind of a big deal for the stability of the civilization that we exist in. But science can't give us a justification of why one group of people who is by and large physiologically stronger than the other should see them as of equal value. It's a non-scientific category. So I think those elements are at the core of. So this is what's weird, is that I think Peterson understands the significance of the gospel better than a lot of Christians do, though he himself isn't. It's like, I was giving a talk on the resurrection at Brown University one time, and this student came up to me afterward, and he's like, I just took a physics class, and he's like, really interesting. He's like, totally changed the way that I see the world, and think about everything. And I'm like, exciting, isn't it? Really fun. He's like, yeah, it's real thrilling. He's like, I don't agree with you on your talk, but he's like, I could see how if you came to believe that is true, it would totally change the way you saw everything in the world. And I really appreciated that conversation, because this kid got it, of like, if I look shift into this and this is true, it's a total paradigm change. And so I think what you see in Peterson is the actual conviction of recognizing the significance of what it would mean if it were true. And that actually being a freeing, bigger vision, more cohesive way of understanding the world. And he's like, it's kind of like, I remember being a kid on a roller coaster, and like, you're going up that first big climb before the drop, and there's a little bit of fear and trembling happening as you're kind of like clunking your way up toward the pinnacle there.
That's the best part.
It almost looks like you see that happening in Peterson in his relationship with God, as then manifest and expressed through Christianity. So that's what I'm saying. The science is, I'm undergrads in physics. Like, I am all on board for the science thing, but I'm not on board for scientism, which says that everything meaningful in life is explainable scientifically. And so that's the distinction that's starting to happen, I think, in a broader sense culturally, where we're seeing the failure of scientism while embracing a theology that makes sense of reality that is perfectly comfortable with including all of our scientific endeavors within it. And so this is where Peterson would say to Dawkins, you haven't had to think about all of this because you do science in a culture that assumes and subconsciously accepts the reliability of the universe, the freedom of thought. He's like, you've been lauded for your academic work, and rightly so, for the stuff you've written and your contrarianism and all of that, but that only exists within a certain set of presuppositions that aren't scientific. They're moral, and the theological roots of that built a culture in which you can do science. So you can pour a quart of water into a 5-gallon bucket, but you can't pour a 5-gallon bucket of water into a quart jar. And so you can pour the quart of science into the 5-gallon bucket of theology, but you can't do it the other way around. And I think you have the Peterson, Holland, Hersey, Ali, Brooks types who are saying, hey, when we try to do this, we end up with a lot of water on the floor because these vessels are not of equal size in their ability to help us make sense of reality and to live well. One works well within the other, and the other one doesn't even allow enough room for the other one to be contained. So I think that's the tangential part to the overall like meta cultural analysis that we're forming here is the I think we're watching the death of scientism and seeing the scientific enterprise flourish within a theological structure.
Yeah, I mean, part of the major issue that we're dealing with is being called a crisis of meaning. And scientism simply is withering on the vine in the face of that. Now, science itself, I mean, can be a very powerful beginning for people because it's a window onto the beauty and the order and the exuberance and the intricacy of the world. But in order to draw deeper conclusions about the significance of what you're seeing in science, you have to step beyond it. And certainly if you want to make ethical decisions, that takes you beyond the purview of science as well, which is just fine, by the way. It's interesting when you make statements like that, and sometimes I've been in conversations where people have received that as though it's an insult to science. It's not. And I would say it's simply a misunderstanding of science to think that it would answer all of that in the first place. But the larger point that Peterson is making here, and I think it's one that Dawkins, I'm hopeful that Dawkins I might actually be moving somewhere really substantial with all of this. But the larger point is that there are a whole host of assumptions that you have to take for granted in order for the scientific enterprise to get off the ground in the first place. You have to assume that the universe is knowable, that it's legible. You have to assume that we can trust our reasoning faculties. You have to assume that if we perform scientific experimentation, that it's going to work. We actually can make contact with reality. Those are not self-evident, have not been self-evident down the ages. Those assumptions flourished, and if you look at the history of science, this is plain for anybody to see. Those assumptions flourished under the patronage of the church. Even though there are popular kind of stories that kind of try to paint the opposite picture, it's not true. Any responsible historian will tell you, once we started believing that the universe was not when people didn't believe the universe was fundamentally chaotic, as many ancients actually did, they saw civilization as this kind of frail shield against what were inherently chaotic forces. Once people began to, if people assumed, for instance, that no, the universe was made by a supremely rational, relational, loving God who has decisively revealed himself to us in his son, Jesus Christ, that was quite conducive, it turned out, for scientific investigation. It didn't close it down at all. In fact, it helped it and allowed it to flourish.
Was it Charles Taylor who said Christianity took the fairies out of the trees?
I believe so.
And so it's when you get into that idea that a fairy isn't the thing that makes the tree grow, but it's the xylem and the phloem and the, underneath the bark and the water transfer and the photosynthesis and all. Like once you remove the fairy from it, then it allows you to ask the questions of how does this work in a way that opens up science. That's just a simple example of what Cameron was saying there.
Yes. So what's Dawkins done in recent years? He's done a pretty big, this is an example of metanoia, a U-turn of the mind, as Leslie Newbigin translates that word. I believe most of our Bibles translate that as repentance, right? But there's some real intellectual work involved in that. If you retrieve the Greek there, and Nathan can actually say more about that than I can. But Dawkins admitting he's a cultural Christian, which he did. I don't know if we mentioned that in this particular episode, but yeah, that's out there. You should go watch that video of him talking about, just type in Dawkins cultural Christian. But the fact that he would do that, he admits, I would rather live in a Christian nation than a Muslim nation, for instance. But he's also recognizing the civilizational benefits of Christianity. So,
but why is that just
what's
in the last
interesting
decade,
here
though?
is
because like if you go back to like 2011 and like the whole new atheist thing was that Christians were dangerous. Am I misremembering something here,
right,
or was that not like the slogan?
Oh no, it's absolutely right. No, that's why this is so insane. Because it was. I mean, this title wasn't his. This was Christopher Hitchens, but he signed off on it completely. But God is not great. How the subtitle of that was how religion poisons everything. Not Christianity, not Hinduism, not Buddhism, no, religion, all of it. I'm a big Christopher Hitchens fan, but that is just an absolutely ludicrous title. I mean, I can believe the publisher let him get away with it, because those kinds of ludicrous titles sell books, and that book sold really well. But yeah, so this was also, we've talked about this before on the podcast. I think the event that catalyzed these efforts and made them go viral, so to speak, was September 11th, because that was a huge wake up call to the world. Who had we remember Francis Fukuyama, who is, by the way, still a relevant thinker and has done a lot since then. But his famous phrase, "the end of history," when he kind of the assumption was liberalism as a political order has sort of has won the day, right? And it's conquered everything. And now religion, as a personal conviction, that's fine. But, as a serious political force, that's a thing of the past. And then, boy, were we disabused of that notion in a very horrendous and tragic way. And then Sam Harris writes Letters to a Christian Nation. That becomes a bestseller. The God Delusion comes out not long after that. That becomes a bestseller, and the rest is kind of history. And so that they, I think, went along with that for a while. But now what's happened is Richard Dawkins has been on the receiving ends of we can call it cancel culture, the anti-intellectual strain that has gripped academia that is purely reactionary. I'm trying to avoid woke and some of the terms that can sometimes
your work
be used
is hard,
in
but
an
it does work.
But
here.
Yeah. So he's been on the receiving end, but he's seen what's happening in his country too. If you look at the UK, and they're a nation. England is a nation in shambles in many ways, economically, politically, socially. He sees that. He's not blind to it, and I think he's just being honest about it.
Okay, so how about this? Would you agree with me, or is a summary of what we're saying here, that Dawkins now lacks the motivation to write The God Delusion? Again, or the sense of I think he's at a different spot personally than where he was at that point in time.
Well, because now he has to say The God Delusion sponsored some of my most cherished civilizational benefits for him, so i.e. the hard sciences. So that's why it's interesting, the place that the impasse that him and Jordan Peterson reach, where Dawkins, I guess it's centered on the virgin birth in this case, but so now is where the rubber hits the road for both of them. It makes sense that Professor Dawkins is still really resistant to something like the virgin birth, but it's disappointing to see that Jordan Peterson is still wobbling on the tee, is still wants to stay on the fence, is still so non-committal.
Hang on a second, though. You don't want somebody... So I have this fear. I mean, we both work deeply in the world of Christian apologetics for a long time, but I do have a fear that there are people who fly the Christian flag because of its internal consistency, not because of an experience that they have themselves. Like, Jesus didn't say, believe and profess these fundamental core things about me because of the social stability of the things that this will generate in your life. So I agree with, I don't want Peterson to say he believes in the virgin birth if he doesn't. That doesn't do anybody any good.
That makes sense.
If he doesn't. I think he has the backbone to say that he does if he does. And I think at the point in which he comes around to actually believing something like that, he will be a phenomenal apologist because he's thought through all of the objections to it, as a profession for the last 5 years. So that's a different. So we're delving a little bit into religious epistemology here, where you can have very powerful, sociologically, political, cultural pointers to saying evidence that says this. It looks like, so Peterson would go so far as to say that there aren't any societies that cause human flourishing where the people that aren't predicated on the idea of the virgin birth. That's a wild claim to say that the societies that produce, the most freedom and justice believe in the virgin birth. And I'll let him justify that on his own time sometime. But that's the depth at which he's thinking that this is significant, whether or not he believes it's true. So, I think there's a limitation here, Cameron, to the degree to which something can be pointed at before it's actually seen. And so that's why I appreciate about Tim Keller's book on the idea of pointers rather than proofs, because salvation and this kind of knowledge is the work of God, not of like, oh, Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins are so smart that they figured out Christianity is true all by themselves. That's also not Christianity.
You heard it here, folks. Nathan Rittenhouse defended Jordan Peterson. We've been picking on Jordan Peterson a lot in some of our recent episodes, so I didn't think I would hear that. That's a really good word, Nathan. And actually, one way I would put that is evidence is necessary to some degree, but insufficient. With Christianity, with true Christianity, what is truly needful is not evidence alone, but an encounter with Christ. And
surprised by joy, someone might write.
Right. And of course, that is a divine encounter, and it is not anything that we manufacture, and it's not something we reason our way to. Although we can be grateful for those pointers, for the clues, the stepping stones, whatever you want to call them. So I think this is a great time for, it's just, to my mind, Nathan, really encouraging to see these kinds of conversations happening between a Jordan Peterson and a Richard Dawkins, of all people. To see Ion Hersey Ali become a Christian, to see David Brooks talking about how he follows Jesus. So we talk a lot about some of the grim stuff that's unfolding. It's good to be able to point to some nice developments as well, and to see
I want to say one other thing.
Thought leaders who are doing this kind of thing.
Let me throw something else in here before you wrap us up, though. This is not unique to Peterson, Brooks, Hersey, Ali. Lots of people are doing this. Like, you don't have to have multiple PhDs to reach these same conclusions. In fact, some of these conclusions might be easier to reach if you don't have the analysis paralysis that goes on in the minds of some of these folks. So I think that it's not a unique thing of like, here are a subset of hyper clever cultural influencers who are trending in this direction. I think we're seeing this as a deep movement across. I mean, most of the churches that I'm visiting and are growing. Like, people, I think, like, collectively, there's I won't call it a revival, but a sense of renewal and longing and effort to reconnect. That before COVID, I would have said, our culture is a little bit like closed off to these considerations. And something in these last 4 years, the tide has shifted here. And so I hope for those of you listening that your church is thinking strategically about how to faithfully minister and guide to this, guide people along the journey of kind of seeking this newfound hunger. I don't know that it's a hunger and thirst for righteousness right out of the gate, but it's definitely a new interest. And the harvest is still plentiful. The workers are still few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to put you in the right place to be helpful, and to put other people in the right place to be helpful too. And the best we can do is leave it in God's hands and cheer these things as we see them go along, and ensure that God gets credit for it and nobody else's cleverness, even though that's deeply appreciated. So I just want to put that in there, Cameron, before you land the plane, that this is not an isolated thing to just a handful of people, but I think it's much broader and deeper than this.
Amen. Well, thank you for tuning in and thinking with us. In case you missed it somewhere in all of this, you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.